Hello, comrades. When people describe particularly evil individuals or regimes, why is it that they use the terms Nazi or fascist, but almost never communist? The racist and empirical nature of these Nazis, or the authoritative and nationalistic fascist, seem to describe most people's views on communist regimes and leaders. You see, most of these communist states and figureheads do use authority. They have a government, laws, and they punish those who don't abide by them, similar to any other government. What makes fascist states different, then? Haven't communists always caused immense suffering and death? Why aren't communists almost less of a revulsion than Nazis? During the 50s of the 20th century, China could have been considered one of the poorest countries in the world. Just a year before, the figurehead Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China, which I may refer to later as the PRC. Most of the rural population was malnourished and lacked a sufficient calorie intake that would be considered at famine level today. From 1911 to 1948, over 18 million Chinese died due to droughts and floods. Famine, drought, flood. This definitely sounds like suffering and death to me. Luckily, measures such as water conservation and irrigation, introduced by a detailed policy, allowed substantial increase in agricultural production, which in turn expanded cultivation nationwide. Flood defenses were constructed to prevent flooding, and fortunately, a 3-year famine from 1959 to 1961 was the last of its scale in China. This policy was a great effort made with intentions to build the Chinese people back from the ashes of third world poverty. So much more contributions that were made can be read in a book called Chinese Road to Socialism. You see, this policy was the Great Leap Forward proposed by Mao Zedong himself. He saved China, benefited the people, and the nation was moving swiftly with its ideology until he died in 1976 at the age of 82. After that, Deng took over. He introduced capitalism and made everything worse. A part of the book, The Deng Xiaoping Era, An Inquiry into the Fate of Chinese Socialism 1978 to 1994, tells us that, and I quote, by 1989, as noted, at least 50 million Yumin wandering people, mostly former peasants, were roaming from city to city seeking employment. Some were to participate in the more violent incidents in the Great Rebellion against the Deng regime in the spring of 1989, and several among them were the first to be executed in the repression that followed. End of quote. So what system really failed here? Under what system was who the dictator? Also, estimates of those who perished in the Great Leap Forward are based largely on demographic deficits. These deficits can also make FDR look like he killed millions himself, like a dictator would. And that's the point. These are inaccurate and unreasonable methods to paint something or someone wrongly. With all of this, one can therefore conclude that Mao was not a dictator of an evil regime, and therefore cannot be classified among the Nazis and fascists. If anything, he didn't have that power as one would think, and among him was a parliament. China even ended up having the largest parliament in the world. However, after capitalist revisionism took over, revisionism, which is pretty much bourgeois reforms with communist image fetishism, can we conclude that Deng can be considered a dictator, at least more so than Mao, classified among the Nazis as well as fascists, which is capitalism in decay and a far-right system anyway. So maybe during Mao's era China wasn't a fascist regime, but certainly the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has to be, right? Well, let's see. The Soviet Union is definitely guilty of housing its fair share of suffering and death. After all, there was plenty of it during the Holodomor. However, the Holodomor is a so-called famine genocide that is supposedly created by Joseph Stalin himself. This concept of the famine being man-made was first decreed by the Nazi press in 1933. Now I must make note that I am not denying the fact that the Holodomor existed. It did. Most Marxist-Leninists themselves recognize this. What isn't popularly noted, though, is that propagandists such as Robert Conquest have used outdated, unreliable, and contradictory data to conclude that the famine in Ukraine was man-made. A decree brought back free market policies in 1932 of the agricultural realm, which in turn lowered procurement quotas. Some critics coined this new action as a new NEP. The reduction of the procurement quota for 1932, combined with the return of grain for villages, are inconsistent with famine. We agree that more grain should have been given to the peasants after the harvest, yet no famine occurred during this time, nor in 1933 or 1934. We have cleared the fact that even though a famine happened in Ukraine, it was not man-made. It is also understandable for a famine to happen. You see, once the Bolsheviks took over Imperial Russia, they were left with an agricultural and semi-feudalistic capitalist state. They had little to grow from, and was trying to transform the nation into an industrial superpower. The average citizens of the Soviet Union actually were very fond and accepting of the targeting of social marginals and kulaks. Propaganda definitely had a role to play in assisting public opinion, but perceptions believed that the terror saved the USSR from defeat. Local officials had a large role in perpetrating the terror, perhaps an even greater role than Stalin himself. But it wasn't Stalin who was responsible, they were. Estimates shown from the so-called capitalist scholars such as Ovinsko and Medvedev vary too widely for those killed for non-political crimes and those who collaborated with the Nazis and capitalists. Now we understand that the purges was a popular opinion for a good reason, and that the famine of Ukraine was not man-made. But what about them evil gulags, right? It seems like every bad guy in history isn't satisfied with just calling them regular prisons, and always coins their own terms for their own versions. The Nazis had concentration camps, the Soviets had gulags. This pasta dish sounding term, however, was not anything like a concentration camp. They were labor camps. Now ask yourself, would you rather go to a tax-paid, isolated space where you can write, read, play on an iPad, watch TV, and get showers, and then go to bed before bedtime? Or would you rather go to a work camp where you actually have to earn all these luxuries? Now you'd probably choose the first option. But hopefully you're not a criminal. However, murderers, pedophiles, sex traffickers, and all of them nasty people, would you want them to have it better? The gulags were fair. There was no taxes, just work for your food and shelter. It isn't meant to be a time out of living in society like a timeout. It's meant to be an incentive to learn from your mistakes. The number of people in Soviet prisons from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s averaged about 2 million, of whom 20 to 40% were released each year. This average is similar to the number imprisoned in the United States in the 1990s. The annual death rate for the Soviet interned population was about 4%, which incorporates the effect of prisoner executions. The Gulag systems were fair and humane, which is definitely not comparable to the concentration camps that housed tons and tons of death and torture. Even though Stalin might not have been that bad as media and biased historians like to say, was he a dictator? On December 12, 1937, Stalin was elected because they have a democratic system. Now you may be thinking that maybe he forced them to vote for him. Yet this is not the case here. Stalin won 870 seats and failed to win 273, with a total of 1,143 seats. Did these 273 individuals get sent to the gulags or anything of a negative nature? Certainly not. He also won 1,085 seats on February 10, 1946, and 1,099 seats on March 12, 1950. So Stalin and Mao were not dictators, and the USSR and PRC during their eras were not evil regimes. But what about Cambodia? At least 2 million were killed during the Khmer Rouge genocide. To answer that is some unsettling news, at least unsettling to some Americans. The Khmer Rouge was not communist, but instead promoted and funded by the CIA. In 1970, President Nixon widened the Vietnam War, stepping up the bombing of Cambodia, where B-52 raids fueled the rise of the genocidal Khmer Rouge. So why doesn't communism have the same terrible reputation as Nazism? It isn't widespread ignorance, and it certainly isn't that anyone favors words over actions. If anything, the only widespread ignorance that exists is when the bourgeoisie continues to spread around these misconceptions. It is understandable why, though. If you were a rich nation that suppressed the people, and an ideology existed that could spread class consciousness and start a rebellion risking the loss of your power and wealth, you might feel compelled to make it look bad too while you still have a foothold over the people. Since the evils of Nazism, Germany has been very apologetic of their history. However, you would think that if nations like Russia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba have failed to apologize for their supposed evil past, wouldn't they be hated until they do so? In the meantime, all good people owe it to the victims of communism to learn what happened to them. Because, even worse than being starved or a victim of communism, are misconceptions out there against the ideology that you died for. You're watching Soviet U. Thank you for your time. Consider subscribing and have a great day.